Ever since humankind had ventured beyond the boundaries of Earth, they had encountered a universe already carved up by an array of powerful species. Among them stood the Celestial Assembly, a conglomeration of the galaxy's mightiest civilizations, wielding their influence like an absolute mandate. The Assembly had subjugated countless worlds through either diplomacy or intimidation, often resorting to ruthless shows of strength when negotiations proved fruitless. For many decades, they had observed Earth's steady emergence from obscurity, watching humanity's technological leaps with a mixture of suspicion and mild fascination. Compared to the ancient civilizations that composed the Assembly, humanity's development seemed modest, their arsenal insignificant, and their presence a mere pinprick in the cosmic map. The cosmic map changed hands one day over many decades, and the result was that the Assembly had always been the last place, but as time passed, that pinprick became an undeniable presence, expanding outward and edging into regions the Assembly deemed their exclusive domain. Tensions initially simmered at lower levels, occasional incidents of trade lanes being disrupted, disputes over mining belts that humans claimed after surveying them for valuable resources, and limited conflicts sparked by accidental encroachments on Assembly territories. Each time these incidents arose, the Assembly's leadership would dispatch diplomatic envoys backed by sizable fleets, confident that humanity would back down at the sight of superior firepower. The humans, though reluctant to be threatened, usually found some compromise short of direct warfare. But with every encounter, the humans demonstrated a stubbornness that perplexed the Assembly's leaders. They would not yield on principle. Their resolve was uncharacteristically rigid for a race so young on the galactic stage. Over the years, human colonies sprouted on the edges of known space, bridging new trade routes and establishing footholds in resource-rich asteroid belts or on frontier planets. This expansion caught the Assembly off guard. How, they wondered, could a race with so little historical cosmic presence become so adept at colonizing and fortifying remote outposts? Council experts speculated that humanity's rapid adaptation stemmed from their relatively short lifespans and innate drive to push boundaries. But speculation turned to alarm when human vessels began appearing in sectors that were indisputably under Assembly authority. At first, the Assembly gave warnings. Then tensions escalated as a few minor skirmishes show that humanity had managed to replicate or even improve upon captured alien technology. Irritated and eager to clamp down on these endless provocations, the Assembly held a summit of its highest-ranking officials. Delegates from the oldest and most esteemed species debated whether to crush humanity once and for all, or merely punish them sufficiently to stifle their ambitions. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed with the rationale that a simple but decisive demonstration of military supremacy would be enough to remind these upstarts of their inferior place. Rather than risk a full-scale war, the Assembly's plan was to target a single, crucial human stronghold. Once that stronghold fell, the reasoning went, Earth itself and its other colonies would surely fall in line. A strategic opportunity presented itself in the form of a human outpost that had recently become a vital nexus for their expansion. It served as a supply station, a command center for exploration into deeper corners of space, and a shield protecting distant colonies. This outpost, perched at the borderline between official Assembly space and human-claimed territories, had grown from a minor refueling point into a well-armed base teeming with advanced defense systems and hardened bunkers. Assembly tacticians believed that by encircling and then crushing this outpost, they could sever humanity's resource chain, undermine morale, and compel Earth's government to capitulate. With that plan in mind, the Assembly dispatched a powerful task force. Every contingent arrived from their home sectors, converging into an imposing fleet. Their combined might was staggering. Colossal carriers bristling with fighter craft, cruisers brandishing planet-busting cannons, specialized frigates equipped with stealth and electronic warfare systems. Even before the formal ultimatum was issued, the outpost suddenly found itself encircled by a semicircle of warships that blotted out the stars. There was nothing subtle about it. This was an emphatic statement. Surrender or be reduced to rubble. The Assembly's command staff sent an immediate broadcast to the outpost, their message crisp and uncompromising. They announced that humanity's continuing intrusions had gone on long enough and that unconditional surrender was demanded. There would be no negotiation, no quarter. If the outpost capitulated, the rest of humankind might be spared further punishment. If they refused, the assembly would unleash the totality of its destructive capability. The message concluded with a warning that the window for surrender was brief. Ignoring it would be folly. From the assembly's perspective, this was routine. They had staged such spectacles before, subjugating insubordinate worlds or rebellious enclaves that underestimated them. Typically, the threat of annihilation was more than enough to force leaders into accepting humiliating terms. Thus, as they broadcast their ultimatum, assembly admirals and generals fully expected the humans to comply. Some of them were already planning the distribution of resources once the outpost fell, discussing who would oversee the new territory in the post-surrender arrangement. But no reply came. There was not a single beep on the comm channels, not a solitary voice from within the fortress. The outpost offered only silence. At first, the assembly chalked it up to possible communication disruptions. Maybe the humans were too rattled to answer promptly, or they were working through their chain of command for official instructions. As the minutes crawled by, however, that silence deepened, and a nervous tension began to seep through the assembly's fleet. This was new. Rarely did a target remain so quiet in the face of a looming threat. Assembly assembled, repeated their warning, raising the intensity. Their second message was laced with examples of prior conquests. They enumerated the colonies that had submitted, the civilizations that had been scattered, the once proud species now paying tribute. And still, they heard only static. Confusion replaced certainty. Where was the fear, the panic, the frantic pleas for mercy? Eventually, suspicion arose that the humans might be jamming transmissions or stalling for time, potentially preparing a last-ditch defense. Scouts were dispatched to recon the outpost perimeter. But again, there was no outward sign of frantic preparation or any attempt at covert infiltration. Just the same thick fortifications glowing under the starry sky. Inside that human outpost, the atmosphere was tense, yet strangely calm. Officers in the command center stared at the incoming signals of the assembly fleet, hearing the formal demands but giving them no official response. Captain Isabel Reyes, the officer in overall command, stood at a console displaying a holographic rendering of the surrounding space. Every ship in the assembly's armada showed up as a bright red symbol. She studied them silently, her jaw set. Eventually, she spoke a single sentence to the assembled staff. "We will not submit." Though no one publicly cheered, a wave of collective acceptance went through the room. The notion of surrender had never truly been on the table. The outpost had been built for precisely this eventuality, a last stand if necessary to prevent any incursion deeper into human space. Reyes gave a succinct series of orders. The base's already formidable shields were boosted by rerouting auxiliary power. Extra layers of armor plating were locked into place. Automated weapon platforms hummed to life on the outpost's outer ring, whirring into position with ominous readiness. In the corridors below, squads of combat personnel donned exosuits, checked their rifles, and ran final tests on heavy artillery. There was no panic, just a resolute acceptance of what was coming. In the subterranean levels, engineers were finalizing fallback measures, hidden tunnels, backup shield generators, and medical stations stocked to handle the inevitable injuries. Everyone had anticipated this day. They were outnumbered and presumably outgunned, but they had drilled for this scenario countless times. Reyes listened calmly as the assembly's second, more threatening broadcast echoed through the base's speakers. She pressed her hand to a control panel, muting it mid-sentence. Then she turned to her communications officer. "Send our final prep signal to Earth," she said, her voice maintaining a measured authority. The officer complied, encoding a short directive that traveled instantly through a secure quantum link. Humans across various star systems would learn that the outpost was under direct siege and intended to stand its ground. When the outpost remained mute to the assembly's final demands, the alien admiral in charge lost patience. She ordered a show of force, instructing her flagship's gunners to fire a volley of warning shots across the outpost's bow. Twin beams of superheated plasma arced over the base, enough to crack lesser fortresses, but the outpost's shield flickered brightly, deflecting the near hit with minimal power strain. From the vantage point of the assembly, the lack of any response besides the shield's mechanical hum was unsettling. "They must be afraid," grumbled one alien officer, trying to reassure himself. Another countered that humans might be planning some elaborate trick, a possibility that had everyone on edge. The admiral relayed new orders to the fleet: probe the outpost with smaller strikes, see how robust their perimeter truly was. Swift interceptors launched in tight formation, streaking toward the outpost with sleek, deadly grace. The plan was to fire a few bursts at vulnerable spots, then pull back and assess the damage. The interceptors fired as they swooped overhead, peppering the outpost with high-energy pulses. The shield once again flared as it absorbed the hits. But the humans did not merely hunker down. Automated flat cannons erupted from the outpost turrets, unleashing a barrage of tungsten slugs. 3 interceptors were shredded in mere seconds. The rest veered off, pilot chatter laced with surprise. They had anticipated some token resistance, but not that level of accuracy. A day passed in this strange stalemate. The assembly maintained its blockade around the outpost, while the humans made no direct attempts to break free. Instead, they engaged in small, calculated exchanges. Drones from the outpost would zip around, gathering intelligence. Every time the assembly launched a new wave of scout craft, they encountered cunningly placed traps, disguised turret emplacements, floating mines, or sensor jamming fields. None of this inflicted catastrophic damage on the assembly's armada, but it chipped away at their morale, forcing them to be cautious. A sense of bafflement spread among the assembly's leadership. This confrontation was supposed to be finished quickly, a demonstration of force followed by a swift capitulation. Yet the outpost stood firm, acting more like a fully stocked fortress than a mere frontier station. Intelligence officers scoured their data for any sign of secret supply corridors. It became apparent that the humans had outfitted the outpost meticulously. Every vantage point bristled with weaponry, corridors were packed with sensors, and their shields were strong enough to weather repeated volleys from the smaller cruisers. Weeks dragged on, and the assembly realized this was no bluff. Humanity had no intention of bowing. Instead of draining the humans' resolve, these probing attacks seemed only to reinforce it. Each assembly tactic was met with a measured, effective counter. The frustration mounted in the upper echelons. Admirals from across the galaxy debated how best to proceed. One faction argued for a full frontal assault, aimed at punching through the outpost defenses by sheer overwhelming force. Another faction cautioned that losses might be unacceptably high, given the humans' thorough preparations and cunning use of technology. Nevertheless, the assembly's tradition of dominance won out. They had never allowed a less established race to hold them at bay. The admirals concluded that the best approach was an all-encompassing assault that would annihilate the outposts and any illusions of human competence. After all, the assembly had never needed to weigh the moral costs of such actions. They had subdued countless worlds, and humans were just another rebellious group waiting to be broken. Plans were drawn for an attack that would coordinate orbital bombardment with ground invasions, ensuring no avenue of escape for the defenders. When the day of the assault arrived, the skies around the outpost were alive with thrusters and the glow of weapon systems charging. Assembly warships moved into lethal formations. Waves of fighters formed arrowhead patterns, ready to deliver targeted strikes. The larger battleships took positions to provide covering fire, each one bristling with gun turrets and missile silos. On their flagship's bridge, the alien admiral surveyed the alignment, convinced of imminent victory. Within the outpost, Captain Reyes and her officers monitored the activity via sensors tuned to read the subtle shifts in energy. They knew the final attack was coming. Anti-air defenses were fully primed, and railgun turrets pivoted in readiness. Scores of ground troops positioned themselves behind thick barricades, scanning the horizon for landing craft. Pilots climbed into the cockpits of their own fighters, a patchwork fleet that had been methodically upgraded with stolen or reverse-engineered alien tech. Most of these fighters lacked the sleekness of assembly designs, but they were robust, adaptable, and equipped with surprisingly potent weaponry. When the assembly bombardment started, it was like a tidal wave of plasma and railgun slugs colliding with the outpost's shield. Sparks flared across the shield's surface, cracks in the defensive grid glowing painfully bright. But the humans had anticipated this. They had a sophisticated system for rerouting power to wherever the shield took the heaviest impact. Every time the assembly tried to concentrate fire on one spot, the outpost subsystems channeled extra energy there, preventing a catastrophic breach. The outpost responded in kind. The humans favored quick, precise strikes, using the asteroids and debris fields near the outpost as cover. They had memorized every inch of local space, turning it into a dangerous labyrinth for less familiar assembly pilots. Below, within the corridors of the base, squads of Marines waited for the inevitable boarding attempts. Sure enough, the assembly started dropping specialized shock troopers onto any surface that looked remotely accessible, but each infiltration team found itself stalled by layers of automated turret defenses, electromagnetic traps designed to disrupt advanced tech, and narrow choke points, heavily guarded by human forces who knew the terrain intimately. While the human defenders lacked the broad range of advanced weaponry boasted by the assembly species, they compensated with resourcefulness and an unrelenting commitment to defend their station. Some squads carried older ballistic firearms that were less vulnerable to the advanced jamming equipment. Others employed newly adapted EMP grenades that disabled alien suits and exoskeletons. And because the humans understood the layout of their fortress thoroughly, they could lure enemy troopers into kill zones. Time and again, the assembly's forces tried to break through. Each fresh wave of shock troopers would land at a different section of the perimeter, thinking they had found a chink in the armor, only to be met with savage resistance. The outpost's corridors echo with gunfire, the hiss of energy blades, and the roar of explosives. Human engineers braved the most dangerous zones to keep critical systems running, often repairing shield generators under direct fire. In the medical bays, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize wounded personnel, using a combination of earth medicine and reverse-engineered alien biotech. The battle raged for days, neither side able to claim an outright advantage, yet the assembly's frustration intensified with each failed offensive. Their battle plan had relied on the assumption that no single human outpost could endure such sustained pressure. But it held, albeit battered and scorched in places. The shield did flicker dangerously at times. Entire wings of the outpost were cratered by direct hits, but the defenders refused to collapse. Meanwhile, the cause for the assembly soared. Squadrons of fighters were decimated in harrowing dogfights. Whole platoons of shock troopers never returned from the labyrinthine corridors. On the capital ships, many of the command crew grew increasingly alarmed by the casualty figures scrolling across their data feeds. A handful of assembly captains even began to question the wisdom of pressing an assault where the defenders displayed such unwavering resolve. Yet their admiral persisted, driven by the belief that a show of weakness now would irreparably damage the assembly's prestige. Eventually, the assembly's high command, spread across multiple star systems, became aware that the siege was not going according to plan. Updates from the front revealed an embarrassing stagnation. Some segments of the Assembly Council demanded an even greater escalation, though that ran the risk of higher casualties. Others proposed pulling back to regroup and reconsolidate. A swirling argument took shape. Was it better to end this conflict quickly by overkill, or to withdraw and save face with a less direct approach? As in the end, their decision was forced by the humans' unwavering defense. The Assembly resolved to commit every ounce of force to a final decisive push. Reinforcements were summoned from outlying territories. Sizable new carriers with fresh fighter wings joined the blockade. Warships with enough firepower to scorch entire planetary surfaces took station around the outpost, preparing for a cataclysmic bombardment. This would be the culminating blow. No fortress could survive such concentrated destruction. The moment the humans detected the arrival of these reinforcements, they knew the final confrontation was at hand. Rezes and her officers convened in a war room deep beneath the base. Holographic displays lit up with the approximate positions of each new assembly vessel. They knew that if the shield fell, the destructive force unleashed upon them would be incalculable. Still, there was no talk of surrender. Instead, Reyes and her chief strategist pored over every scrap of intelligence. They prepped fallback positions, readied hidden weapon emplacements that had not yet been revealed, and made sure there would be no chance for the assembly to slip in quietly. At dawn on the final day, if dawn could be used in the vacuum of space, A rolling shockwave of energy beams hammered the outpost's shield. The entire fortress shook. Inside the command center, alarms blared, screens flickered, and sparks showered from overtaxed panels. Soldiers on the lower levels braced themselves, as if expecting the roof to collapse on their heads. Yet the shield stubbornly clung to life, re-energizing itself from emergency reserves. Outside, the assembly's capital ships advanced in unison, unleashing a storm of missiles, plasma bolts, and railgun slugs. This time, the humans responded with everything they had. Missile silos that had remained dormant opened to disgorge relentless salvos into the attacking formation. Bombers from hidden hangars soared forth, weaving dangerously through flak to deliver payloads against key assembly cruisers. A special unit of human fighters rigged with top-secret cloaking technology struck from behind the lines, sowing confusion among the alien warships. Meanwhile, every turret along the outpost perimeter flared to life, dispatching interceptors with chilling efficiency. The pitched battle reached a level of intensity unlike anything seen before. The vacuum between the outpost and the surrounding fleet was lit by a tapestry of explosions, tracer rounds, and laser bursts. Ships on both sides erupted into fireballs that vented oxygen and debris. On the ground, squads battled intruders in close-quarters firefights. Some parts of the outpost lost gravity due to structural damage, forcing defenders and invaders alike to adapt to zero-G combat. In one particularly fierce corridor, a human platoon pinned down a troop of elite assembly commandos by magnetizing the floor at strategic intervals, pulling the invaders' boots off balance and exposing them to sniper fire. Through the chaos, stories of extraordinary valor and grim sacrifice spread among the defenders. One team of engineers managed to hold a breach in the outer hall, sealing it from the inside. While they themselves were exposed to vacuum, they clung to harnesses, working with numb fingers to weld the break shut. They saved the base from a catastrophic depressurization, but few survived the ordeal. And then, in another sector, a medic and her staff treated a wave of wounded soldiers under constant bombardment, refusing to evacuate even when the overhead structure threatened collapse. Her heroics helped keep key personnel alive to mount further defense. So, up in orbit, the assembly's main offensive began to unravel under the withering response. Their forward ships, hammered by wave after wave of retaliatory strikes, started to lose formation. In the swirling melee, entire capital vessels succumbed to well-placed torpedoes, breaking apart in cataclysmic blasts that forced their neighboring ships to scramble out of the debris field. The assembly's fighter wings became disorganized as their command frequencies were jammed by cunning hacking routines that the humans had devised. By the time the assembly admirals realized their final push was stalling, they had lost the ability to coordinate effectively. Several key command ships had already been destroyed or heavily damaged. Communication networks flickered in and out, either jammed or physically severed by sustained attacks. Isolated pockets of the assembly fleet continued to fight desperately, but they could not regroup into a coherent line of attack on the outpost side. They understood that if they continued to survive, the assembly might be compelled to withdraw. At last, the culminating moment arrived. Several human squadrons converged on the largest assembly battleship, the symbol of the final assault. Its multiple shield layers had buckled under unrelenting fire, leaving parts of its hull exposed. Torpedoes slammed into an already weakened flank. The battleship erupted in a series of chain reaction blasts, splitting in half. This disaster was structured in a series of chain reaction blasts, splitting in half. Its flaming wreckage drifted perilously close to a second assembly carrier, forcing that carrier's pilots to execute emergency maneuvers. The entire front line crumbled, with the surviving assembly ships peeling off to avoid further collisions. In a moment that would go down in human military history, the battered outpost stood as the victor, or at least the side still holding its ground. Stunned by their mounting casualties and the thoroughness of the human defense, the assembly's high command finally issued the order to retreat. The once formidable blockade scattered, warships vanishing into faster-than-light corridors to regroup, far from the outpost's lethal range. But those who couldn't jump simply surrendered themselves, hoping for mercy that they had not been prepared to offer mere weeks ago. At the outpost, relief was tempered by the heavy cost. Crews immediately set about rescue operations, searching for survivors in shattered decks. Medical personnel worked around the clock to save the grievously injured. Engineers scrambled to patch structural breaches before vital systems failed entirely. A subdued hush filled corridors that had once echoed with gunfire. There was no triumphant fanfare, no grand parade. Everyone was too exhausted, too conscious of how narrowly they had survived. Still, there was a collective exhalation of pride. The defenders had achieved the unimaginable. They had stared down the galaxy's preeminent military alliance and refused to bend. As the outpost stabilized, a message was relayed via secure channels to Earth and other human territories. It was a simple statement, recorded by Captain Reyes herself, her voice still carrying the adrenaline of the fight. The outpost stands. We have turned them back. We remain resolute. In the days and weeks that followed, the repercussions echoed across the stars. News traveled fast, eventually reaching the highest echelons of the Assembly. Many were appalled at the scale of the losses. Fleet admirals faced censure, and the species who had lost the most resources demanded explanations for how an upstart race could stand toe-to-toe with the Celestial Assembly. Some suggested that the humans must have exploited some unknown technology. Others speculated that the Assembly's arrogance had led them into a trap. Behind closed doors, the Assembly's leaders debated their next course of action. A direct second assault, even larger in scale, was possible, but the fiasco had cost them dearly in both military assets and political capital. Meanwhile, there was the looming threat that other frontier worlds, emboldened by humanity's successful stand, might begin to question the Assembly's dominion. If these lesser worlds started to see the Assembly as fallible or weakened, rebellions could ignite in far-flung regions that had long paid grudging tribute. Yet for the humans, the immediate priority was survival and reinforcement. They understood that the Assembly, while chastening, remained a colossal force. Earth and its allies had been given a reprieve, not a guarantee. Military strategists from every human colony scrambled to learn from the outpost battle. What had worked? What weaknesses had been exposed? Logistics teams raced to replenish the outpost supplies, shipping in replacement equipment, fresh troops, and medical relief. Over time, engineers undertook repairs that would return the fortress to full operational status and perhaps even surpass its previous capabilities. An uneasy calm fell over the region. The Assembly withdrew to positions from which they could monitor the outpost, while humans fortified their newly validated perimeter. Skirmishes still happened occasionally. An Assembly scout ship would stray too close and be warned off, or a human patrol might intercept unknown vessels in neutral space. But neither side was eager to launch another all-out confrontation, not when the memory of the bloodbath remained fresh. Rumors spread that certain Assembly factions wanted to attempt more subversive methods. Instead of a direct assault, they might fund insurgencies within human space, sabotage supply routes, or set bounties on key human scientists. In turn, some human leaders quietly advocated for forging alliances with other species that chafed under the Assembly's thumb, hoping to build a stronger coalition. In this climate of mutual wariness, small diplomatic feelers were occasionally extended. But trust was in short supply. The story of the outpost's stand became a galvanizing legend for humanity. News channels broadcast interviews with weary survivors who spoke about their will to resist, describing the intense bombardments and narrow escapes. War correspondents recounted acts of heroism. A pilot flying her crippled fighter directly into an enemy bomber's flight path to save a transport of wounded soldiers, or a communications tech who stayed at her console despite the deck buckling beneath her, ensuring vital targeting data stayed accurate. My quiet corners of Earth, families lit candles or left flowers for those who had not returned. There were ceremonies of remembrance, but also of defiance. Humanity had always been a species that resisted submission, forging its fate through trial after trial. The outpost battle reaffirmed that trait on a galactic stage. Even though the race was young by cosmic standards, they had proven that their determination could rival millennia-old empires. Meanwhile, on the Assembly's side, a period of introspection ensued. Their illusions of invincibility had been tarnished. In hushed corridors, bureaucrats and military strategists debated how to handle the human problem. Some still claimed that if the Assembly coordinated properly and launched a well-planned campaign, humanity could be subjugated like any other rebellious people. Others warned that the cost-to-benefit ratio would be disastrous, risking decades of conflict. After all, There were other threats looming in the galaxy, other anomalies that demanded attention. Could the Assembly truly afford to sink such immense resources into punishing a single, determined species? A minority faction even began arguing for diplomacy. They reasoned that if humanity was this capable now, forging an alliance might yield benefits. The humans had proven they were skilled innovators, adept at retro-engineering alien tech and applying it in unexpected ways. Perhaps they could be valuable partners if only the Assembly would abandon its need to dominate. This notion met heavy resistance from the more conservative voices. Many in the Assembly's power structure viewed humans as irritants that needed to learn their place. The debate raged on, in council halls stretching across the galaxy. Back at the outpost, the defenders refused to grow complacent. Repairs proceeded day and night, with entire sections of the station refitted to be more resilient. New bunkers were constructed deeper below the surface. Advanced sensor grids scanned constantly for signs of an impending assault. Patrols and scout wings conducted regular sweeps of the surrounding sector, determined not to be caught off guard again. On the face of it, the outpost seemed at peace, but his heart throbbed with vigilance.